My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 26.1. Aquaman is a joke. At least, that's how he was portrayed in all of the media that I saw him in as a child. That's the version of the character that I grew up with, lampooned by Saturday Night Live, by Cartoon Network ads, and eventually just the internet. When the character was first created in 1941, though, by Paul Norris and Mortimer Weisinger, they weren't joking at all. Mortimer Mort Weisinger was an editor for National Periodicals, the publisher that would eventually become DC Comics in March of 1941. He largely oversaw the Superman and Batman comics. However, he was also tasked with dreaming up new characters who would appear in the comic More Fun Comics. Among their number was Aquaman, in a story drawn by my fellow Ohioan, a man named Paul Norris. The concept was fairly simple. Aquaman's origin stated that his father was an undersea explorer who had found the long-lost country of Atlantis. His dad built a watertight dwelling in one of the palaces and studied Atlantean culture and technology. Using this strange base of knowledge, he taught his son how to be a human being who lives underwater. He could breathe underwater, naturally, had increased strength and speed, and could even communicate with sea life. Using these powers, the Aquaman bravely defended a sinking refugee ship from Nazi attackers. And that was pretty much it for Aquaman's inaugural adventure. It's important to keep in mind that, culturally speaking, submarines as a tool of war were still relatively new to the public at the time. They were heavily used in the First World War, perhaps the most famous incident being the Nazis' sinking of the refugee ship, the Lusitania, in 1915. It is very easy to see the inspiration of that real-world incident reflected in Aquaman's first appearance. The continued threat of naval dangers into World War II breathed new life into Aquaman's adventures, and he so stayed largely the same for most of the 1940s and 50s, regularly appearing in More Fun Comics. He wasn't a huge hit, don't get me wrong. He didn't star in his own comic book until the 1960s, but he was well liked enough that Aquaman regularly appeared in anthology books or in backup features. People liked Aquaman. It was in the 1960s that Aquaman's story got its first update for his leading role in Adventure Comics. It was here that much of the long-standing canon regarding his origin was put into place. His mother was actually Atlanta, an exiled princess from Atlantis who went to the surface world and met Tom Curry, a lighthouse keeper. The two of them fell in love, and they had a young boy named Arthur Curry. Thanks to his mixed heritage, Arthur could swim when he was just 10 months old and breathe underwater. Eventually, they found that he could speak with sea life. What were strange abilities learned through training originally were now just inborn gifts of Arthur's story. These changes have stuck with the character ever since. The 1960s also saw the creation of the Justice League, a team-up book featuring some of DC's most popular characters, like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. It also featured some less popular but not too bad heroes, like the Flash, Green Lantern, the Martian Manhunter, and Aquaman. I think that it's very important to note that before the Justice League comic was initially produced, most of these comic characters stood on their own. What we now know as the DC universe of titles did not exist back then. There was just a bunch of different books that were published by DC Comics, almost more like what you think of as a book publisher nowadays, how they'll publish dozens of different books that have nothing to do with each other. Putting all of those characters together in one book was meant to help the sales of all of their titles by introducing the fans of the big characters to the other ones. For the most part, this idea worked, and in 1973 it led to the Justice League getting their own cartoon. Called Super Friends, or Challenge of the Super Friends, take your pick, this cartoon is where Aquaman went from protector of the seas and a fairly popular superhero to the joke that he would be known as for the next several decades. As a standalone character existing in his own universe and battling Nazi submarines or other sea craft, Aquaman works pretty well. He is faster than boats, he's able to punch through the armored hulls of enemy ships, and thanks to those gifts, he is able to transport victims of attacks back to shore. But you place somebody like that in the same room with Superman, who can fly and doesn't need to breathe and is just as strong and who is also bulletproof, and Aquaman suddenly doesn't seem that impressive. In his More Fun Comics debut, the Nazis knock out Aquaman by dropping a hammer on his head. And that kind of stuff just doesn't happen when you're reading a Superman comic. Aquaman wasn't as super as Superman. His villains weren't as cool or memorable as Batman's, nor was he as smart. He wasn't as fast as the Flash. His powers weren't as adaptable as the Martian Manhunter or the Green Lantern. And he clearly wasn't as sexy as Wonder Woman at the time. On his own, Aquaman is okay, but in a room with these people? What did he add? Given how most of the Super Friends exist outside of the ocean, and how disconnected a land-dwelling audience generally is from the ocean, Aquaman ended up relegated to a smaller role on the cartoon. As time went on, Aquaman became more and more of a joke, the lamest member of the team, able to speak with dolphins and swim fast. Woo! He's been the butt of jokes on Family Guy, South Park, Robot Chicken, The Big Bang Theory, even SpongeBob SquarePants, where he serves as the inspiration for Mermaid Man. In the words of Rodney Dangerfield, he got no respect. Despite that public perception, there has been a steady, quiet army of Aquaman fans who love the character. Since the 1980s, DC has kept an Aquaman ongoing series as part of its publishing line. Yes, it has floundered at times, but like the tides, Aquaman keeps on coming back. If you doubt his popularity, then let's briefly compare him to Marvel's water-based guy, Namor. To date, Namor has starred in approximately 130 Namor comic books, the single longest series of which ran for 62 issues. Aquaman has starred in over 400 Aquaman comics. His longest-running comic was 75 issues, and he has had 3 ongoing series reach over 50 issues. A 4th one made it into the 30s. Aquaman, for all of his poor public PR, sells. To contrast the more ridiculous public perception fueled by TV, the comics tend to feature the more serious side of the character. They focus on his responsibility as the King of Atlantis and the weight of the crown. They focus on the drama of his family and his dual nature as someone caught between the land and the sea. In pop culture, Aquaman might be a joke, but in the comics, Aquaman is serious business. I first checked out an Aquaman comic in 2006 as part of DC's 1 year later publishing event. After their latest world-altering story, DC had all of their titles suddenly jump 1 year into the future, causing status quo shifts across the board and mysteries happening in the comic. This was meant to not only set up exploration of what happened in that 1 year gap, but it was also meant to give the books an easy jumping-on point for new readers. Aquaman became Aquaman, Sword of Atlantis, and it basically became an undersea fantasy book. Like, literally, Aquaman had a sword, he is put on a quest by a wizard, and he has a party that he travels with. It is totally the Lord of the Rings, but underwater. It's the perfect pitch for a guy like me, to be quite honest. It's what I would have pitched if I was sitting in an office with the chance to pitch. But, for some reason, it didn't work for me. I dropped the book after a few issues, and for the next few years, I was unconcerned about Aquaman's adventures. Until DC's next publishing event, the New 52. In 2011, DC saw an opportunity to do something absolutely unique in the modern world of publishing comics. They saw a chance to restart. They canceled their entire publishing line and relaunched absolutely everything. The idea was to give new readers a way to fall in love with DC without needing to read the 60-plus years of comic books that preceded it. But it was also to build a cohesive universe at the same time. DC relaunched their entire publishing line with 52 new comics, featuring some of the biggest creators on some of their most classic characters, and on some of their less well-known, too. Among them was Aquaman, and the main reason I picked up the book was because of author Geoff Johns. At this point, Johns was fairly known in the comic book world as the guy who saved Green Lantern Hal Jordan from being a bad guy for the rest of his life. And I'm talking like he's the kind of a bad guy who he blew up a city and killed a bunch of his coworkers too. Like, we thought he had crossed the line and he was gone for good. But Johns reinvigorated the whole Green Lantern brand by recreating the broader Green Lantern core, and then he did the same with the mythos by expanding the concept of lanterns into other colors and emotional varieties, creating a variety of new threats and breathing new life into old characters. He then did the same kind of work for the Flash mythos, reintroducing the classic and long-dead character Barry Allen back to the mantle. Johns orchestrated several of DC's biggest, coolest crossovers, and in my reading of those stories, I found him to be a really good writer. Johns is good at picking up a character, finding the thing that makes them work, and then he just focuses the writing on that one thing. It is a very simple way of writing a character, but it is also something that I have found a lot of people can't do. A lot of people get bogged down in the history and the story and all of the changes a character goes through, and Johns just focuses, and it works. And now here was Johns helping to relaunch the entire DC line. He was writing the new volume of the Justice League, the new volume of Green Lantern, and the new volume of Aquaman. I had to check it out. So why was it important for me to tell you all of this? Because you need to understand the way that the world looks at Aquaman today is very different from the way that the world looked at Aquaman back in 2011. The Aquaman movie and Jason Momoa's portrayal of the character have drastically changed the public perception of Aquaman. He's handsome, he's hunky, he's got a sense of humor, and he's got a bit of an edge to him that didn't quite exist before in the public's eye, even if it already did exist in the comics. A large part of the reason that Aquaman movie even exists is because of the work that Geoff Johns did to recontextualize the character, and the work that he did to get him on the big screen. Johns was the co-founder and co-chairman of DC Films, acting as the producer or executive producer for many of the films that made up the early attempts at the DC Extended Universe. He not only co-produced the Aquaman movie, but he co-wrote it as well. That means that he has pretty effectively rebuilt the entire public's perception of Aquaman. And all of that work started in 2011's volume of Aquaman, which we'll be exploring here on the podcast for the next several weeks. I'm not sure how much of Aquaman I'm going to cover yet. Johns wrote the book for 25 issues, but the follow-up author was Jeff Parker, who wrote the book until issue 40. I have up to that point, but that is where I stopped getting the title. I don't know if I'll cover just Johns' run or if I'm also going to cover Parker's. I think it's just going to depend on how good of a time I have breaking these comics down. I haven't read these books since they first came out, making them 12 years old, so I'm very interested to see how they hold up and what I have forgotten. In general, I remember these books being very good, so I've got my fingers crossed. Next week, we'll be introducing the world of Arthur Curry. We will also see how the public views him, how he views himself, and what he wants his role in the world to be. We will also see a new threat rise from the depths of the ocean. And they're hungry. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 26.2, Aquaman, part of our world. Thank you. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me, to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.